What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Creator Economics. And on this episode, we really wanted to dig in deep on my co-star, Blake Robbins' background. We did an episode on my background a couple weeks ago, so it's only fitting that we bounce back to Blake and talk a little bit about what he does at Ludlow, how he got to Ludlow, jump into 100 Thieves, and everything else in his ecosystem. So enjoy. So Blake, the first question, and this is exactly how we started mine off. Let's step way back before Ludlow, before you've co-founded 100 Thieves. Talk a little bit about how you got here.
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I was born and raised in the suburbs of Detroit, and honestly, growing up, I just thought I'd end up in the automotive world. My dad worked in the automotive industry, and I just assumed that was literally all I knew. Like, I knew early on I didn't want to be a lawyer or a doctor because my dad worked in the business world and the automotive side, and I was like, that's what I'm going to do. And I went through high school and all of that just assuming I was going to do business and end up at some Fortune 500 company. And I went to Michigan State, and when I was at Michigan State, I basically went to this career fair, and I was like, my freshman year I went to a career fair, and I saw these like Fortune 500 companies, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like, one, these people seem miserable, and then like two, none of these people were willing to like talk to me because I was a freshman and I was asking for an internship, and I was just like, that doesn't seem right. Like, I'm ambitious and I want to do things. Why is no one talking to me? And why is no one giving me a real shot? And at that point, I sort of just took a step back, and I was like, there has to be some type of business that would appreciate like an ambitious kid. And that's when I started to learn about startups and tech, and I just became obsessed after that. Like, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is a thing. Yeah.
Did your dad work at Ford?
No, he was like an automotive supplier doing like ball bearings, you know, like it's literally just like not even like crazy in the big three, more on like the actual supplier side.
So you were at this career fair, and then you started learning about what, the startup ecosystem?
Yeah, I went on. So when I was in high school, I like always dabbled and like tried to learn about apps, and like I was, you know, the kid that was jailbreaking their phone when they were in high school, and just became obsessed with that world. And I started to discover like TechCrunch, and so I would like read TechCrunch at that time, and I started to discover like Paul Graham from Y Combinator in that world, and like over time, I just started reading more and more. I became obsessed. So after that career fair, I was like, okay, wait, like, how do I work at a startup? Or like, how do I get into this world? And I sort of took a crazy approach after that, where I was like, you know what? I have no way in. I'm at Michigan State. We're not really known for having connections to startups or tech or anything like that. And I went and actually like cold emailed every company that was on the front page of TechCrunch, like for like a week straight. And it weirdly worked out in that like one of the companies that I emailed, they responded and they're like, hey, yeah, we'll take like, you know, an intern who's like willing to hustle for us. And I really had no idea what was going on. They just raised like $30 million with a company called Zarly, and like they just raised a big round. And I was like, this is going to be like amazing. I'm going to do some type of internship for them. I actually ended up doing campus marketing for them. And through that, I just like fell in love with this world, and I was just like, oh my gosh, like I really like this world. Like I need to work at more startups. I need to find a way into startups. And I did campus marketing for them, but the real thing was, if you were the top campus marketer, and like there was, I don't know, 25 schools that did campus marketing, you got to go to a board meeting, and they flew you out to San Francisco for a week. And so I just like hustled like crazy to get people to sign up, and like it was really just a competition of who can get the most signups. And I would like sit at the bus stop at Michigan State and be like, hey, can you just like give me your email address and I'll sign you up, like, please? And people just like listened and were willing to sign up. And I ended up being like a top campus marketer, and that led to me going out to San Francisco my freshman year. And I was just like, whoa, this is sweet. Like, what is this life? Like, I need to work at a startup. I need to get into this world. And actually, on that trip is the first time that I really learned about venture capital. I went to a board meeting for this company, Zarly, and I was just like, this is someone's job? Like, people just, like, invest in companies and, like, help advise and talk about really, like, you know, strategic things. That seems like the dream job. And from that point forward, I just became obsessed. And I was like, I need to find out how to get into venture capital.
So I know this is something that I talked about a little bit, is like I got obsessed with the sports agency world and I just consumed everything I could find. How did you start learning about venture capital, startups? I'm sure when you first heard like, yeah, they raised $30 million, you're probably like, what does that even mean? Like, how did you start to learn about this industry?
Yeah, honestly, I was navigating it pretty blind, and like, again, this kid who grew up with no idea or understanding of this entire world. I just started reading TechCrunch at that time, and then discovered, Y Combinator and Paul Graham, started to read more of that stuff. And then eventually I started going on Twitter, and Twitter in like this crazy way has become, I mean, honestly, it's been like a huge catalyst for my entire career, in that like I just started to follow the right people and discover new people. Like I would just throw my thoughts out there, and then people would be like, oh, you should read this person's post, or like, have you heard of this company? And like over time, I just started to like consume everything. I was trying to read and watch every single thing you can think of, and whether it was like Gary Vee and like learning about like hustling, or like it was, I don't know, just actual reading Paul Graham's old posts. And like I at this point I've probably read like every single Paul Graham post multiple times, and just internalized like what it means to run a startup, to be a founder, to be an investor. And I just read like every single thing that I can think of or find, and eventually I feel like I just started to like absorb it and become a part of the ecosystem.
What do you remember about that first board meeting that you were in when you flew out to San Francisco?
Oh, I just remember like sitting in that room and being like, one, I don't know how I ended up here. And like, I'm like so confused, as like, I'm just like this kid. Like I was probably like 18 at the time, and just being like, why I'm in this room. And then the second part was like their board was incredible. Like it was like Meg Whitman and like, jeez, I believe Ashton Kutcher was on the board, and like there was like a really stacked board, and I was like, what am I doing in this room? And they were actually talking, like one piece of the board meeting was they were talking about the campus marketing program and like how it did well or whatever, and that led to like me talking. I just remember being so nervous and being like, what am I doing here? But again, like I left that meeting just being like, I need to find a way into this world, and I need to go to a board meeting I need to start like getting into venture capital, because this is just amazing to me.
Do you still talk to anyone that was in that board meeting today?
No, I don't, because like I would say I've crossed paths with a few of those people, and like it's funny, like they don't remember that board meeting or me being in there, but like I definitely crossed paths with some of those figures, and I'm like, whoa, okay, this is like younger me, or like if I talk to 18-year-old me, they would like not believe that I'm doing deals with these people or talking with those people.
So then you head back to Michigan State after this board meeting in San Francisco. What happened? Did you end up getting an internship at a startup? Like what was the next step?
Yeah, from that, I like really thought, I was like, I'm going to be a venture capitalist. And I like read every single thing there was about how you can become a venture capitalist. And if you look online of what people will say, they'll basically say like, good luck. Like you're not going to end up in venture capital after you graduate, or like you're going to need to sell your company for a lot of money. Like you're going to need to like do this at the end of your career, all of that stuff. And I was just like, I don't really care. Like I'm going to find a way in. And I think like I was pretty shameless at that time, and that I just didn't care. Like I was like, I'm just going to email really big investors or firms and leverage the fact that I'm a college student who wants to learn. And surprisingly, like a lot of people were willing to respond and talk to me. But even when they did talk to me, they're just like, hey, you're not going to end up in this world. And so for me, I thought like, what was the next best thing that I could do? Or like, how could I break into this world? And I sort of just like took a step back, and I was like, hey, what if I actually like do my internships while I'm in college as like they're my investments? And they're like, I can't actually invest money into these businesses, but I can like get my resume to almost be my portfolio. And like if I go and join these companies, by the time I graduate, they might look really good. Like what are the highest growth companies that I can join? And so by the time I graduate, they'll look like they're amazing businesses. And at that time, I basically was like, I need to find like the dream internship. And like I really had Zarly as my like first internship, and I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get into anywhere else from here. I'll figure it out. And I went to another career fair at Michigan State. This is like a really tiny one for the major that I was, which was supply chain and like operations. And they had and SpaceX was there, which is the most random thing ever. But like this career fair again was every Fortune 500 company, and then like SpaceX was in a corner, and SpaceX had like 2 people there, and they were like, we're only looking for a full-time person. We don't really like, we're not looking for an intern, but we're here. And like, they didn't even have like a sign. Like it was literally just like 2 people standing there. And I went up to them and I was just like, hey, I'm obsessed with Elon. And again, this is like 2012. And they were just like, what? You're like, you know who Elon is? And I like was basically just like geeked out with them for the entire career fair for like 4 hours, 5 hours. And at the end of it, they're like, hey, like maybe we should like talk about having you as an intern, and went through the full like interview process and ended up getting an internship with SpaceX going into my sophomore year, and that was a pretty insane experience for a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah. Okay. So now this was after he had acquired and started Tesla, correct?
Yeah. So it was right around. It was probably like a year or two. Maybe like 3 years into both of those, but like SpaceX had that like one successful launch. They didn't have like a website. I remember telling my parents like, hey, I'm going to this company called SpaceX, and they were just like, what are you talking about? Like, you're working at a private space company? That doesn't seem like a thing. Like that's just not a thing overall. And I eventually just like convinced them that it was real, and they like let me fly out to LA for it. But Tesla was also just a thing they had maybe released a Roadster. But there was not like a real cult or anything around Elon at that point. Like Elon probably had 40,000 followers on Twitter at that point. Like it was very early days. Like the story I knew was like he had done PayPal, and then he was basically like taking all of his earnings from that and going all in on these 2 businesses. And like I was just like, that seems insane. And if you can pull off either of these, then it would be incredible. And then like obviously we know the story now where like both have become incredibly successful. But it was a wild period in time when I was there, because they had just finally like had one successful launch, and it was starting to like really snowball from there.
Yeah. So talk a little bit. Now I'm curious. Talk a little bit about your internship at SpaceX. What did they have you doing? I'm guessing you were in Hawthorne, LA, like at the headquarters.
Yeah, I was in Hawthorne. I was probably one of the first real business interns that SpaceX ever had. I only know one other business intern that they had at that time. And I mean, I was going into my sophomore year. I got like flown out. They like had, intern housing. And you lived with like other interns. All of my roommates were, I kid you not, like robotics or like aerospace engineers or robotics PhDs. And I was just sitting there and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I've never had more imposter syndrome in my entire life. I was like, what am I doing here? Like these people were rocket scientists. And my job actually in hindsight is pretty crazy, but my job was I worked for the procurement team at SpaceX, which is like basically buying parts from strategic suppliers. And my role there was basically convincing suppliers at the time that SpaceX was going to be a thing. Like it sounds really insane now, but at the time they were trying to order very small quantities from these big suppliers, big aerospace suppliers, and these big aerospace suppliers are like, we're going to shut down our lines to like make 20 parts for you. And thankfully like we were able to convince them to work with us, but it was, I mean, there were quite a few that were like, no chance, like what, we're not going to pay attention to this like startup. And that was a crazy experience. I mean, like SpaceX was a really intense environment, and like if you read books on what the culture is like there, like I think you'll find a lot. And for me, I think it was a real eye-opening experience, because it sort of was like my first real look at what a startup was like, and like a high growth environment where like people just never stopped working. I mean, I worked every weekend when I was there. Like I barely even explored LA when I was in LA. Like and I was working nonstop, and I wouldn't trade it for anything, because it was a really, really meaningful experience. But it was a really intense environment, and I learned a lot just around business and just the entire ecosystem.
Did you try and get a full-time job after your internship ended, or was this like your junior year of college?
I was going into my junior year, or maybe going into my sophomore year, I think, actually. And actually they wanted me to come back the year after. And I had caught up with my manager like from that internship recently. And I remember she was like, I like thought I like ruined your experience, and I thought like you hated us forever, and like you were never going to come back, and all of this. And the reality is like if I wanted to do aerospace for the rest of my life, I probably would have gone there. Like that is the one place where I would want to be. For me, I always like had these aspirations to get into venture capital and do that side of this world, that I like realized pretty quickly that I didn't want to pigeonhole myself directly into aerospace. And I'm passionate about space and that world, and what SpaceX's mission is incredible. I just don't know if like I was willing to devote my entire life to it. And so for me, it was like, this is a really amazing experience. I got to meet some incredible people, but I knew pretty quickly like I didn't want to stay there forever.
Yeah, makes total sense. So then, okay, so you head back for your junior year. You don't go back to SpaceX. What's the next step? Did you get another internship at a different startup?
Yeah, so from that point, I was like, okay, I have SpaceX on my resume. And it started to do, like, SpaceX started to pick up a lot of steam after I was there. Like, they had just started to do, I think it was a Grasshopper at that time, where, like, they showed the first video of the, like, landing. And it was just, like, a really big period in time where, like, it got more hype. And so I was like, okay, where am I going to intern now? Or like, what am I going to join? And going into my junior year, this is actually a crazy story. I was basically like debating whether to apply to like Lyft, which was like just starting off, you know, and or go and actually like join a more high growth company. And at the time, I decided to go with a company called Nest, which makes, you know, thermostats and smoke alarms. And it's actually pretty crazy because they got acquired, and while I was basically like in my interview process with them, they got acquired by Google for a very sizable amount, and I joined that, and like sort of in a transition period of actually when the acquisition happened. So I get there, the acquisition was probably announced a month or so before. But it was a crazy period in transitioning of like, okay, we're now going to scale up like crazy because we have way more resources. I think when I got there, they were 400 employees. And then when I left 4 months later, they were probably up to 1,200 employees. And they completely outgrew every building that they were in. And that was a really crazy experience. My role there was actually doing like reverse logistics, which is like returns and repairs for units of like, how do you get units back from people's homes back to China to be refurbished, and then like have a refurbished units to then give back out when things break. And I spent, I would say, half the time that I was there, I spent in Europe and helping them launch in Europe, like how to handle returns and get those back from Europe to China. And that was a wild experience as well. Like, to be honest, that was like the most fake it till you make it experience I probably have ever had. And that like I had no knowledge of how to do reverse logistics or returns or any of that. And I was pretty transparent with like everyone, but they're like, look, you seem like you can figure it out. And thankfully I did, but it was a wild experience to be thrown into that and be like, okay, I guess I'll figure it out. And it worked out in the end.
So this was a Google full-time position right after the acquisition, and you said you were there for 4 months?
Yeah, exactly. And then I did. So then after that, like I was going at that point, you know, I was like, okay, do I like, and something I did at that role that was a little bit unique is I was finally in the Bay Area, and I was like, okay, now I can find a way to like meet other investors or founders and things like that. And I was starting to get more active on Twitter, and I just started reaching out to like, I basically reached out to every investor at Nest, and I was pretty shameless again. And I was like, hey, I'm an intern. I think like we should meet. You know, I know this is a big win for you. Again, very shameless. And thankfully, like almost all of them replied. And I remember my manager at Nest being like, did you just go and meet with one of our investors? Like, what had just happened? And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I just like reached out and figured they'd meet with me. And he was just like, no one, like literally no one does that. Like, what are you doing? Like, why did you do that? And to the point where like, I remember like one of the co-founders of Nest was like, did you just meet with one of our investors? Like, you're an intern. Like, what are you doing? And I really just was like, I need to find a way into venture capital, and I need to ask these people what they did. How can I get into this world? And thankfully, like a few of those investors actually were really helpful, and they gave me a lot of insight into like what you can do to break in. And it was nothing like I hadn't heard, but like starting those conversations was really great for me, and I like started to build those relationships. And so while I was at Nest, I just started to build way more relationships with people in the Bay Area and just around tech and VC, and like people that I interned with. Actually, like a lot of them either ended up going and starting companies, or they like went and worked in venture as well. Like one of the individuals that I worked with is now a partner at Sequoia, and like it's like a very close friend that I had just from that experience. And so that's I think more than anything, it was just like surrounding myself around smart people and getting to meet really great people through that experience.
So then, did you end up staying in the Valley after you transitioned out of Nest?
So I went. That was my junior year. Then I went back.
So this was still the internship at Nest.
Yeah. So that was still my internship, and then so I went back to going into my senior year. At that point, I was like, okay, I need to find a way like into venture, and I knew there was a fund in Detroit when I was in East Lansing called Ludlow, and I had known these guys because I'd been following them on Twitter and whatever. I had reached out to them several times and like never got a response, and I was like, I need to find a way in. I need to get in touch with these people, and I reached out to someone that I met while I was at Nest. His name's Ryan Hoover, who started a company called Product Hunt, and Ludlow invested in Product Hunt, and I reached out to Ryan and I was like, is there any way you can just vouch for me to like these guys at Ludlow? I'd love to work with them, or I'd love to intern with them. And Ryan thankfully vouched for me. Like Ryan barely knew me, but he vouched for me. And that led to basically me getting a meeting with my two partners now at Ludlow, Jonathan and Brett. And I met with them and I was like, hey, is there any way I can intern for you my senior year? I've really liked coursework. Like I can, shadow you or whatever. And they're like, we don't really want an intern. We don't really want someone to like, be hovering around us. And then also like, we just don't have the time for an intern. And I was like, I need to find a way in, please. Like, is there any way I can just like sit and I won't do anything that like annoys you? Like, give me an email address and I'll just find a way to add value. And they were like, I guess, what's the harm? And so I did that my senior year, and I basically just started reaching out to everyone. Like I was so shameless again, and I started reaching back out to all the people that I initially reached out to, saying like, hey, I finally made it into venture. Like, now will you talk to me? And all those people were willing to then talk to me then. And I was just like, once I was in, I was like, I'm going to find a way to just keep snowballing it. And so that was a pretty wild experience. And so did that my entire senior year. And they were in the period of trying to like raise another fund. And when I was interning with them, and they were like, we'd love to have you join full time, but we're going to raise another fund. And like, we want to have you a part of that. And I was basically like, okay, well, once you raise that fund, let me know. I'll join full time. But like, I'm not going to just blindly commit to something without, the fund being raised. And so I went and worked at Google full time for 6 months in Ann Arbor in Michigan. And I was doing sales, and I was basically just like, let's do this job and I'll figure out, maybe at one point I'll end up back at Ludlow. I have no idea how long it will take to fundraise, because they told me the first fund, took forever. And then 6 months in, they're like, hey, we had our first close. We want to have you come join. And I jumped ship immediately because that's my dream job. And been here now for almost 5.5 years full time.
So when you're an intern and then also to your full-time position, you said that you were just trying to provide value. Like, what did that look like? What were you trying to do?
Ooh, I mean, it was like, one, I was just trying to build out my network as much as possible, and like in a way that they didn't have. Like, I was trying to meet other investors that I knew they maybe didn't know or like didn't have connections to. And so like I could be like, hey, you don't have connections to, I don't know, so-and-so firm. I can make introductions there. And like there was a point where I was just like making introductions as an intern to like, the partners of this fund. And I think they eventually were like, what? Like, who is this kid introducing us to like partners at other big funds, and like who is this kid overall? And then I would just start sending deals. I would just be like, here are the companies I hear that are raising. Have you heard of them? And I just started being like really, I would just go on offense, and I would just like try and find as many deals as I could, and like almost like a deal junkie of just like, here's 50 deals that I've heard about in the past month. Have you seen any of these? And they're like, what? Like, how are you finding these? What are these deals? Can you get us an introduction to these? And like, I basically just from that was eventually like, okay, like it's clear that he has connections, he's building out his network, and he's like approaching this in a unique way. And thankfully that led to them being like, you should join us.
So I want to back up because you said something earlier when you were at Nest. You said that this is when I started on Twitter. Yes. And this is how you and I met. You followed me on Twitter. I followed you. I think we exchanged some DMs. This was 2+ years ago. Time flies. But you said something really interesting to me when we first met, because I kept asking you about your Twitter because I thought it was so unique, because you were basically learning in public is I think what you ended up calling it. You were like, I'm just willing to learn out in the open. And if I sound stupid, I sound stupid. But at the end of the day, like, I'm just trying to learn. Talk a little bit about that and like where that first came from.
Yeah, honestly, so I being in the suburbs of Detroit at the time, and like being based in the Midwest overall, like I was just like, how am I going to break through the noise? How am I going to build connections with people on the coast when most tech is on the coast? And I was like, Twitter is weirdly this town square of just like where everyone hangs out within tech. And I was like, I need to figure out a way to break through the noise and get to know people through this. I just saw it as an opportunity of like, if I'm not actually going to be in the physical location of LA, San Francisco, or New York, or wherever it might be, I'm not going to meet these people unless I'm like able to be online and meet them. And I started to go through and I basically tweeted for like 2 years without anyone paying attention to what I was saying. Like I was just tweeting into the abyss. Like literally no one knew what I was saying. And like it's pretty crazy. Like I was just literally talking to no one, and I would just like reply to random people as well. Like I viewed it as like, okay, I can again start to learn more in public, and when people ask for things, maybe I can send them interesting articles or interesting companies or people that I think might be interesting to them. And over time, people started to pay attention, and I just continued to basically like document everything that I was learning. And that, like, I don't know, let's say I was spending time in gaming or content creator space or whatever, and like this podcast ends up becoming a good example of that, where we're putting our thoughts of like in real time as the industry evolves of just how we're thinking about things. And I just like always believed that there's very little like proprietary knowledge, and that like, there's no unique ideas, like any of that stuff. Like I think so much of it is around execution. And like if I gave you the recipe to build a big billion-dollar business, like it purely comes down to your execution at the end of the day. Like having that in front of you doesn't really mean anything. And so and most people just like pick and choose what to learn anyways. And so for me, I've just always been like, let me just leave breadcrumbs of where I'm spending time, because I forget the name of like the law, but there's like a joke law of the internet that's like, if you post the wrong answer on the internet, like you'll get the right answer immediately, because people will just like tell you. They'll be like, whoa, like that's not this, like we'll fix it immediately. And I've always sort of just viewed like learning in public in that way, where I'm just putting my thoughts out there, and they're not always 100% thought out. Like I would say they're 90% thought out, and then it's like, let me see what other people think, and am I crazy for thinking this, or what else should I be reading or watching or learning about within this space? And that's what Twitter has been amazing for me. And they're like, I can just throw out like, I don't know, a request for a startup or thinking about some random area of the internet, and people who are far smarter than me will be like, have you seen this? Have you read about this? Have you seen that? And I'm like, whoa, okay, like you just did like, I sort of just like crowdsourced diligence or like crowdsourced information from all these really smart people. And that's like the power of the internet in my mind.
Who have you met? I know you've met a lot of your good friends now, but who are you like close with that you met on Twitter still to this day? And you don't have to name a ton of people, and I know there's a lot, because I'm the same way. But like, who are the ones that are like top of mind? Oh my gosh.
I mean, I've met, I kid you not, over 1,000 people like through Twitter. Probably even more. And that like some of my closest friends I've met through Twitter. Like I mean, I talk to Jackson Dahl from 100 Thieves almost every single day. Like I met Nadeshot through Twitter. I met Fred through Twitter. Like I met all of these people through Twitter. I met Lee Jin through Twitter. Like I met all of these people purely through the internet and Twitter. And like, I honestly don't know how I would meet these people if I didn't. Like I don't know how I'd meet you if I didn't do this, like if I didn't tweet. Like I would be like, I think the beauty of Twitter, in my opinion, is because I'm documenting my thoughts in real time, and like they're time stamped in a way, people get to understand how I'm thinking about the space, and like it sort of becomes this way to be like, oh wow, like he's actually thinking about this in a creative way, or like that's a unique perspective, and that sort of builds the trust of the relationship. And so over time, when you like, maybe when you clicked on my profile, you're like, oh, okay, like he actually does know what he's talking about. I should respond. And that became like, in my mind, like that was when things really clicked. Is like, oh wow, if I can like talk about this stuff, or like, I don't know, if I talk about like Mr. Beast, 4 years ago, that hopefully becomes more of an indicator that like I'm spending time in this area, and like a much better indicator that like I'm real, or whatever that might be. And so it just breaks down those barriers than like a cold email of me just messaging you. Like I can't tell you how many people I tweet with for, I don't know, 6 months, and then eventually like we'll DM and be like, we should actually chat. Like, why have we never chatted before? And then like that becomes a real friendship over time.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Some of my best friends I've met on Twitter, and I hate when people say like Twitter's dead. They just don't understand the true value that you can get from Twitter. And when I first met you, and I still don't use Twitter like I should, and I know you yell at me all the time about it, but at the time when I first met you, I didn't use Twitter at all. I had like 10 tweets. But I think I had something in my bio about Night Media, and I saw you tweet at me and then followed me, and then that's just kind of how it started. But some of your tweets blow my mind. They're so well thought out. I think the one that like comes to mind is the obvious one from like last week about Uniswap, and just how big of an investment that was, and how big of a win it was for Paradigm. But yeah, some of your tweets, I think, just as I like scroll through, and I see them every morning. I think that every day you have like a banger tweet that you come out with. How do you think about these? Are you like setting 30 minutes out of your day to just conceptualize tweets?
I would say that like initially it was like more intentional when I was like first starting out on Twitter. I was like, I should, think about what I'm going to tweet way more carefully. And like, I think over time, the way that I think about it is just like, what are the interesting things? Like, what's the most interesting thing that I read or learned about recently? And let me just like put that out there. Like I think it's like, if you view it as like you learn one new thing a day, then like for me it's like, okay, I try and learn as much as possible every day, and whatever like the most interesting learning or thought that came in my mind is, I usually just write that down. And like I don't always tweet it like when it comes up. Like there's days where I just like put in my notes and I like sit down and I'm like, is that dumb to like put out there in the world? But eventually, over time, like most of my tweets these days are like on the fly of just like, okay, like I just thought about this, or I just heard this thought. And a lot of it comes from conversations as well. Like these are like, you could probably backtrack almost every one of my tweets to like some conversation that I was having. And it might even just be like this conversation. Like, maybe tomorrow I'll tweet something about like how I think about creating tweets and how I view this all. But I think it's in a lot of ways, I just want to be the person who people are following who are like learning something new, or like, I view it as like I'm trying to dig and like find like hidden treasures or like stories that aren't really talked about, and that's when I just like I realize that's like the most interesting or most entertaining for me, and I think a lot of people find value when I start to do that stuff.
Without question. And if you guys are not following Blake, it's linked in the description. What the hell are you doing? Go follow him right now. You will not regret it, from the wisdom that you will get from some of these. Oh man,
I appreciate that.
And so what was, out of curiosity, and I want to get to the 100 Thieves, meeting Nade Shot and kind of talk about that. What was the first investment that you made at Ludlow?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it was technically U2's actually, which is pretty crazy.
Which was not a vinyl toy company.
Yeah. It was a totally different business, but it's pivoted and it was a real bet on the people. I think, for like I remember the first real investment I tried to do actually was a company called Periscope, if you remember that company.
The Twitter video.
Yeah. And the story there is, I was an intern at Ludlow at the time, and one of my friends had sent me the beta, and I remember it being actually very similar to like Clubhouse, and like when the beta happened, everyone was like, "There's so much FOMO of like I need to get on this, and like I need to figure this out." And I remember I got on the beta, and my other two partners were like, "What? How did you get on the beta? Like everyone's talking about this." And I remember reaching out to Kayvon, who was the CEO, and like, I was so like sold out. I was like, this is gonna be my first investment. This is gonna be, you know, like a huge winner. I love this. This company's amazing. And I sent Kayvon probably like a 20-page doc of like, here's all the product suggestions I would give. Like, I was like really trying to hustle. And it turns out at that time, like, it was all sort of moot, and that like they were already acquired by Twitter at the point that I was trying to convince him to let us invest. But I had gotten to know Kayvon through that, and I was just like, wow, this is like a really eye-opening experience. And that was really fun, and I think in a lot of ways legitimized like that I could find interesting stuff to Jonathan and Brett, where they're like, okay, yeah, we should probably like bring you on board. And they're like, you're finding these companies before we are, before a lot of the top investors in Silicon Valley are.
And then when did you start digging into esports? Because this is obviously leading up to the Nade Shot. And was there any other esports organizations that you were looking at before 100 Thieves?
Yeah, the story there is the biggest LP in our fund at that time was Dan Gilbert, who owns like Quicken Loans and the Cavs in that world. And they were starting to look at esports teams and like gaming. And I sort of like the sort of side story or parallel story to all of this is that I used to play a lot of games, and I still play way too many games. But growing up, I like legitimately thought I was going to be a professional gamer or like a professional Call of Duty player. And so when I got into venture and people started talking about esports, I was like, this is really weird. Like, I lived and breathed this. Like, I grew up in like the peak Halo days, and I remember looking up to some of these Halo stars, and like, I remember Walshy and T-Squared and these people being like the biggest stars in my mind. And so when investors were talking about it, I was like, what? Like, this is already a thing. What are people talking about? And so I got pulled into a meeting with Dan and his team, and they were like, talking about how they were thinking about, you know, what it looks like to make an investment in an esports team. They were starting to talk to a few teams that already at that point. But I sort of got brought in, and they're like, what do you think of all this? You obviously like still watch this stuff. Like, I was already watching League and Counter-Strike and big and all of that. And so I was by far the most up to speed as far as just like what is actually going on in this world. And from that, this is 2015, I would say, around there, 2015, 2016. And we had just started to like hear whispers that Riot was going to do franchising for League of Legends, and Overwatch League was just starting to happen. And they sort of were like, you're now our guy, Blake. Like, you know, help us figure out how to navigate this space. And there was another person on that team named Jake Cohen who works on Dan's team. And him and I sort of just led the charge of like, what do we do in this space? And we kept coming back to like, what do we actually get if we buy one of these teams? And that like, this is pre-franchising, pre all of that. So our assumption was like, we're going to have to buy one of these teams or invest in one of these teams, and then we're going to have to invest even more to do like franchising. And we're like, there has to be another opportunity or another option here. And we threw out like, you know, what if we just go into franchising with, you know, Dan Gilbert's team, and, you know, or like, what would that look like? And I think internally everyone was aligned that like we should do it in a really endemic way that was like authentic. And so I threw out this idea that like, hey, there's this guy, Nade Shot. I watch a lot of his content, and he is really unique, really personable, played for one of the best Call of Duty teams, now sort of sitting on his own on YouTube. He had just started like the initial 100 Thieves brand, and then it was sitting dormant for like 6 months, you know, at this point. And I threw out there like, what if we convince him to come back and like actually do the esports team like real this time? And everyone was like, yeah, what? Why did you not mention this like before? Like, let's go like talk with him. And everyone was like really hyped, and I was just like, well, the one catch is that I don't actually know Nade Shot. Like, I'm this random guy who's going to be messaging him, but I don't know him at all. I just watch his content, and I'm like pretty much a fan, if nothing else, of Nade Shot at this point. And everyone's just like, we need to find a way to get in touch with him because he seems like the perfect person. And I reached out to Nade Shot over Twitter DMs. I don't remember at what point he followed me on Twitter, but it was similar to like you, where I probably just tweeted to him and eventually he followed me. But there was a period in time where I DM'd him for a month and a half, 2 months straight. Like, I kid you not, like every day for like a month, I DM'd him, and I was like, I'm telling you, a billionaire wants to meet with you. There's an incredible opportunity in front of you. And like, I mean, looking back, it reads like the biggest scam ever of like, who's this random kid messaging me saying this? And eventually, I convinced him to respond by sort of holding out like NBA finals tickets. I was like, the Cavs are in the NBA finals. You should come out. Like, let's meet. And he responded and was like, let's do it. And let's like, I'm happy to meet now. And
I'm happy to meet. I'll come out for a basketball game.
Yeah, I'll come out for a basketball game.
Matt still sucks at answering texts.
Oh, yeah. By the way, like I learned to not take it personal because he does not respond to my text even to this day. I have to hit him with like 10 texts before he responds. And so what happened was I put together like an initial pitch deck of like what we were going to present to Dan on what 100 Thieves was going to be is like, media, apparel, and esports was like the 3 pillars at that point. And I put together a small deck and I sent it to Nadeshot and I was like, hey, just like look through this and when you land, like get ready because we're going to present it. And he basically like texted me when he landed and was like, this is pretty dope. Like this is cool. I like this. And I mean, if you've ever met Nadeshot, which I know you have, like he's just so charismatic and so good when he's like authentically bought into something. So he went into that meeting and just absolutely crushed it. Like, I mean, he sold it incredibly well and everyone just left that as like, we need to do this. The period that like happened after was like, okay, we're all excited. We all want to do this. Like, now what? And that was, there was probably a 6-month period of time there where it was like, okay, Nadeshot's not going to give up his, YouTube career, and he's going to have to do this behind the scenes while we get this deal done. We figure out what this actually looks like. At that point, Riot Franchising had started to announce that they're going to do like the application process. And so we were working on the application at that point. And then Nadeshot and I, and also Jay Cohen, we're just like trying to figure out what it looks like to actually build a real business around this. And so we interviewed a bunch of we interviewed so many different people for every single role you can think of. I initially called in Jackson Dahl, who I mentioned before, as like, hey, you're my friend, I know you love esports, you should think about doing this as like a first employee or like basically a co-founder. Like he was there. He was literally the first person on that team, and he came in and was, basically has done every single role that you can think of at 100 Thieves at this point, from apparel to signing the league team to signing all of that. Called him as like basically like, hey, I think this is a crazy opportunity. And then we helped like hire out basically like the first couple of employees, and eventually John Robinson, who's the president and COO over there. And that was just a crazy experience for so many reasons. Like, we were, hiring League of Legends coaches, and like I was negotiating player salaries for that first season. Like it got really deep in the weeds. And then, I'm still on the board over there and still actively involved, but day to day, not nearly as involved. Like that team is involved, and they're very, very like on their own and an amazing organization to watch it all come to life. But the early days was pretty wild. It was just like trying to convince Matt to do this, and he took a big bet on us that we were going to, figure this out, and very thankful that he did take it back. Because again, it was just a random DM conversation that evolved into something much more.
Yeah, so I want to go back to Ludlow a little bit now that we spoke about 100 Thieves, and hopefully this is helpful to some people, but I want you to really talk about like what you look for when you're investing in a startup. Because I know you probably meet with hundreds of startups a month, if not thousands. You probably see 1,000, meet with 100. I want you to talk a little bit about like, how do you break down a company? Like, are you looking at the management team and the operations team? Like, are you looking at product market fit? Like, what are the things in your head that are really important?
Yeah, I mean, we're a small team of 3, and we're investing out of a $60 million fund. And so we primarily invest at like seed and pre-seed stage, which basically just means like idea stage, or like it could be pre-product. They might have a product and some revenue. It depends all on like the industry and sector that they're in. But the real point is like, these are really early stage companies. Like usually it's 1 or 2 people, 3 people, very, very small teams. For us as a fund, we're very generalist in nature. Like, I know public facing, I spend a lot of time in the creator space or gaming or esports or that, but like our portfolio is all across the board in terms of types of companies. And like the only real way that we can explain it is that we're betting on people. And I think for us, we're all very aware that like we don't necessarily know the future. And I think founders have a much better grasp of the future than we do. And like if they're building a company, they likely know that industry better than almost anyone, or at least they should if they're running that business, and they should have real conviction around what products they're going to build within that space. And that leads us to so many different spaces. And like that could be enterprise software, that could be creator stuff, that could be a new media business. Like we are all across the board. The real thread that connects it all is we're betting on people. And that's always been the case. Like, I think if we used any other rationale of trying to explain how we are, getting into this business or like how we're choosing a business, it would just be a lie. Like, it would just be like hindsight bias of like, oh yeah, we chose that because we knew this could be a massive market. Like, no chance. Like we chose this because we believed in those people and we wanted to be a part of that journey and really just bet on them at the end of the day. Yeah.
I mean, this might be a tough question for you to answer, but what do you think are the characteristics of a good startup founder? And I'm sure, and also a follow-up question to that, have you ever invested in solo founders, or do you like to invest in multiple founders within a company?
Yeah, I would say we are, like, I think the characteristics actually like varies. I think the truth is the main thing we're looking for is like, is this the right person to be building this business? And if so, like why? And also just like, why is the timing for this right? I think so much of this is there's a lot of timing that plays into all of this of like, why is this company going to happen now versus 5 years from now or 5 years ago? Or like, why didn't this work in previous iterations? I think, now that I've been in this business for 5+ years, you start to see the same pitch over and over again. And you're like, why hasn't this worked? And you're starting to then be like, oh, maybe now is the time that it will work. But I think honestly, the main piece that we're thinking about is like, is this the right person? And the characteristics there is just like, I don't know, let's say we're investing in a farm company that's doing like software as a service for farming. Like, maybe the founder has an incredible background in like growing up on a farm, and they watched their parents, run the farm, and they learned firsthand what the inefficiency are, and therefore like they're seeing, and then they went to college and studied like computer science, and now they're like, here's all the ways that we can improve, the farm industry. Like that's a perfect example of like what would get us excited. And those unique insights, I would say, more than anything else, is what gets us like the most excited. I think there is like this other piece of, I don't know, let's say there's two companies going head to head, and you're like looking at those two companies and you're just like, why would I choose this one over the other, even though they're going after the exact same space? You're ultimately betting on the people, and what decides like why you're going to bet on those people versus the other could be completely subjective. And in 99% of the case, it's completely subjective. But like, you might just be like, wow, they're much better at sales. They're much better at recruiting. They're much better at like understanding and being like compassionate about the problem that they're solving for. But the reality is like, we are betting on those specific individuals. And when we go all in, we're like, we're going to bet on this one area and category with this person running that business. And we believe they're going to be the ones that will figure it out.
Yeah, without question. And so you came in at fund 2 for Ludlow.
Yep.
And you guys are where are you at in the life cycle of fund 2?
We are we're in fund. We just started fund 4.
Fund 4. Yeah. And so talk a little bit. one investment that I think people will find interesting that you guys did, that Jimmy and I got to work pretty closely with this company starting in 2017, was Honey. So were you at Ludlow when you guys made that initial investment into Honey?
I was actually an intern at the time, and that was Honey was interesting for so many reasons, because I actually had heard of Honey like through like Reddit. I've always been a big Reddit user, and I remember there used to be Ask Reddits of like, what are your favorite Chrome extensions? And like Honey just sort of dominated that, and like everyone was like, use Honey. This is the place to be, and like you should be using Honey. And when we did that investment, that was really around like, again, it was like two people and an idea, like it was very, very early on, and like all the credit goes to Jonathan Pratt on just like having the conviction at that time. But we were one of the first investors there, and that was just a wild ride of watching that go to the moon as far as just like how fast that's grown. And I think for me, the main takeaway of that business is it was like really just like they were very aligned with everyone within the ecosystem, and that like if you used it, then like there was actually very little downside to using it. And in exchange, like you were getting way more upside, and like you could actually get savings. And like being aligned with your users to give them savings is just like the biggest no-brainer pitch. And like I think, you know, when Jimmy used it, or like when Jimmy pushes it out and advertises for it, like the message is so clear, you know, like being like, hey, do you want to like save on your purchases online? That is such an like a no-brainer. Like and it's like, you know, everyone immediately goes to like, what's the catch, you know? like what's going on, like why am I getting, you know, money back, or why are they helping me with coupons, and why are they giving me cash back? But the reality is like there isn't really a catch. It's just like they found a business that is very aligned with their users, and that's like the holy grail. Because at that point, like you're like the viral word of mouth of like anyone that I know that uses Chrome has at least tried Honey and uses it, because there's like, why would I not have this? Like, this is just a better experience. And I think there was a period in time where people were looking at Chrome extensions as like, can this be a real big business? Like, who knows? But I think they've proven time and time again that like, this is a real business, and you know, it's really sticky.
Without question. And so I do want to talk a little bit about, you said you're on Fund 4. So what does Fund 4 look like? How far are you guys into Fund 4? And then also, like, what are some deals that you guys are looking at right now, or that have done in the past few months that you find really exciting?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, so we did Fund 4. We just closed maybe a month or two ago on, and that's $60 million fund. The previous two funds were right around 50 million, so pretty much same strategy. And we are, you know, as a fund, like we jump all over the place in terms of areas that we're spending time in. Like I you know, a recent one that we just did was a company that's doing, and I think you actually invested in it as well, which is like almost a stock brokerage with game mechanics in it, and that's a really exciting one. When I'm excited for that to come live. And then, you know, I spend a lot of time trying to think of like other recent investments that we've done. Like we just did one out of Y Combinator that will come live at some point that we'll be able to announce. And I think the truth is we are all over the place. And for me, like what gets me excited is really the people. And like I love investing and finding out about new spaces that I had no idea even existed. Like that's the dream of being a VC, is like you get on a call and you're like, what? Like this is a thing? Like I didn't even realize there was a business here. And then like you start diving in and it almost becomes like intoxicating, because you're just like, what? This is incredible that there is, you know, a whole industry here. And then you're like, wait, it's like $1 trillion business? What's going on? Like, how did I not know that debt collection or something? Like you just overlooked overall. And that for me is just like really exciting, of just like finding out about new businesses or industries that you just never even knew could exist. And then like in a lot of ways they're creating new markets, and that's where it gets really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, we just announced our fund internally, Night Ventures, and I mean, selfishly, the reason I wanted to do it is just I get to meet amazing people, amazing founders, and I get to hear about things that I didn't even think were possible, and companies that I didn't even know could exist. And so for me, like it's been a breath of fresh air, just like getting to show up at work every day and just getting to meet people that are so incredibly excited about running their company and where it's at and why they want to grow. And so it's been, you know, incredibly fulfilling for me as it has been for you. I have to ask this question because, you know, this is kind of where we started this interview. If you are an 18, 19, 20-year-old right now listening to this podcast, maybe you're at Michigan State, maybe you're at the University of Michigan, I don't know. What advice would you give them if they wanted to work as a venture capitalist? How do you get into the industry? Do you think it's the same playbook that you did, or do you think it's different?
I think the reality is that it is really hard to break into this industry. Like I'm not going to be someone who will sugarcoat it and say like, you know, you can break in very easily. Like the truth is it is hard, but I think and the truth is like it's not for everyone. And I think for me, I really tried to understand like one, what stage that I want to be at. Like I know for myself, like I probably wouldn't do great at a later stage fund or a bigger fund. Like I knew for me, I wanted to be at a small team at the earliest stages because that's just what is most exciting to me. So I think like the first step is figuring that out. Like, you know, like what gets you excited? Why are you actually excited about being in venture capital? Because there are so many different motivating factors of why you should be in this. And if it's not just like genuine curiosity, I think you'll probably burn out of this industry pretty quickly. And I think if you're trying to break in, the truth is like it goes back to in some ways what I did, where it's just like try and add value to as many people as you can, and try and like I spoke with an investor really early on when I was trying to get into this, and his name is David Hornick, and he's a pretty legendary investor. And at the time he was like, my advice to you is just give, and like eventually ask. He's like, but try and give like value 9 times before you ask on the 10th time for something. And that's like always resonated with me, and even to this day is just how I operate. And that like I always try and add value, and like I'm not the person who's gonna like ask for time. And you know, looking back, I asked for a lot of people's time, but I was really trying to view it as like, how can I add value to these people? And so like when I was cold emailing these people, I was like, have you seen this company? What do you think of this company? Or have you seen this? Like it's trying to understand how the people that you're reaching out to are spending their time, and how you can like immediately add value to that person. Like there's someone who watches this podcast that literally made us a website, you know, like, and it's a beautiful website.
It's amazing.
And like that caught my attention, and like that's way more. And I'm not saying like go and make websites for everyone for free, you know, type of thing, but like it is a way to stand out and break through the noise. And it is competitive out there, but it's gonna like if you do these things, you will break through the noise. And that's ultimately like my biggest piece there is like you're going to have to try and find a way to break through the noise, because there is a lot of people reaching out to a lot of different people, and like try and be really specific of like who you actually want to meet and why. Because I think if you go way too broad, like you're just not going to get as far. Like I think it's trying to find the right mentors and get the right people around you, because that will pay way more dividends over time than anything else.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Somebody clip that, put it on the Clips channel. That was explained so well, and I think it holds true to so many industries, not just VC. I think it holds true to, you know, my industry and anything else. So couldn't have said it better myself. Guys, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Like I said, go follow Blake on Twitter. We'll link it down below. Make sure you follow him on Twitter. It's going to be in the description. Hope you like this episode, and we will be back probably next week. Thanks, guys.